Well, let's turn together tonight in God's Word to Mark's Gospel, chapter 10. We'll be looking at verses 1 through 12 together. Mark 10, verses 1 through 12, where God's Word reads as follows. And he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again. And again, as was his custom, he taught them. And Pharisees came up, and in order to test him, asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" And he answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away." And Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." And in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter. And he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." And so far, the reading from God's Word, may He add its blessing to our hearts. Well, the topic of divorce is really a bit of a yawner. Or at least that's what the world would have you believe. The world would have you believe that marriages simply come and go, that that's just the way of life. So take the statistics in our nation. For example, in 2021, there were approximately 2 million marriages in the United States. That same year, there were approximately 700,000 divorces. So, of course, that's not of those 2 million marriages, but if you calculate it, of the 2 million marriages that were added in our nation, 35% of those were eliminated that same year by divorces of other marriages. That's a staggering number. But that number is actually better than it has been in our nation. The 80s really were the worst time for divorce in our country. But whatever the case may be, 35% is scandal enough, and you don't hear a mention about it in our nation. Divorce has ceased to be something to talk about. It's simply a part of life. Now, also in the church, I recognize that divorce is a difficult subject and an emotional subject. Everybody in this room probably in some way has been touched by divorce, either directly or indirectly. And in some cases, in the Christian church, the levels of complication when it comes to divorce are so great that it becomes almost, well, it seems anyways, impossible to untangle that web. And in those moments, I think it's good for us all to pause before we begin talking about this emotional and difficult subject. It is important for us to remember the way Jesus spoke to people who had in the past been entangled in this sin. Think, for example, in John 4, when Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman at the well. She had been divorced how many times? 5 times. And she was living with a different man at this point. And yet Jesus deals mercifully with this woman. He is merciful to the repentant sinner. And so it is good for us to be merciful, to speak kindly, to consider how we might deal gently with each other in this regard as well. Now, when we come to Mark 10, it can be our temptation to try to spiritualize what Jesus is saying here. We can talk about how Christ is married to the church, and that is true. We are the bride, and He is the bridegroom, and how Christ never divorces from His church, and that would be an accurate statement. It would be an accurate statement from the wrong part of Scripture, because that's not what this text is talking about. This text is very plainly setting before us something of the duties that are required of us in light of belonging to God. So we are God's by possession through Christ, and He sets before us now His teaching, His instruction on what we are to do with this subject of divorce. So our focus isn't going to be on Christ's redemption. That sits in the background. That's in some sense assumed when it comes to this text. We're assuming Christ's redemption, that we are joined to Christ by faith, and because we are joined to Christ by faith, therefore, Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. It is not Christ speaking of how he will not divorce his people, but it is Christ talking about what his people should do in their own relationships, how they should live in this sinful world with regard to marriage. So God is teaching the Christian what his response to divorce ought to be. Now, the goal here in this sermon is not to condemn anyone's past, but it is to let the Scripture instruct us going forward. How are we, in light of all the sins that's in our background, and all of us have that baggage, in light of all that baggage, how do we now live in light of this teaching? How do we live with relation to marriage and divorce? And what does this text teach us? Well, in the very basic and most general sense, this text sets before us that divorce separates what God has made one flesh in marriage. Divorce separates what God has made one flesh in marriage. Now, before we can unpack that theological truth, we have to think about what sits underneath it. So Jesus is continuing his teaching ministry. You see that in verse 1, where he is now out of Galilee. He's moved to Judea, and the crowds have gathered, and Christ teaches. But there is something that we should notice. Christ is on his way from Galilee to Jerusalem with one goal. And Christ's goal in moving from Galilee to Jerusalem is to move towards his suffering, towards his crucifixion, towards his passion, as it's described sometimes. Now, what you see as Christ gets closer to Jerusalem, closer to this suffering, this death, being raised after 3 days, as he gets closer, you see the Pharisees increase their pressure. And you see the same thing here in verse 2. The Pharisees come and they ask Jesus a question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, it explains to us why the Pharisees ask this question. The Pharisees are not asking this question because they are sincerely pursuing an answer to the truth. The Pharisees are asking this question kind of as a gotcha question. They think there's no way Jesus can answer this question that's not going to make some people upset with him. There were some that viewed divorce very liberally in Jewish tradition. Some viewed it very narrowly, and so they're banking on the fact that Jesus' answer is going to make some people upset. They want people to turn against Christ. So the Pharisees ask him, what do you think? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Well, before we get to the answer of that question, we have to get to what's behind it. What has to exist in order for this question even to be possible? And that one thing is marriage, of course. You can't talk about divorce if there is no marriage. Only married people are able to divorce. And so we have to understand marriage before we consider divorce. And we're going to deal with marriage in a very cursory way. We're going to just hit two main highlights of marriage so that we can in a more informed way consider what Jesus says in response about divorce. So there's two questions that we want to answer about marriage. The first question that we want to answer is, where did marriage come from? So when the Pharisees are asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? First we have to understand, where did this thing, marriage, come from? And the way that people talk today in our society, it seems fairly clear that the opinion is that marriage is some kind of a human convention that can be adjusted according to societal pressures and societal change. That certainly has been the position in the United States as declared by the Supreme Court of this land, which tried to adjust the definition of marriage as needed. But Christ, and what sits underneath Christ's answer about divorce, underneath all of that sits this foundation that marriage is not established by man, is not a human custom, it's not a human convention, but this is something that is established by God. And you see that in Christ's answer. Christ doesn't appeal to any human society, any tradition, anything like that. He goes right to the beginning in verse 6. From the beginning of creation, that's where Christ grounds his definition and his justification for his answer. See, Jesus is quoting from Genesis and refers then to God creating male and female, Genesis 1 verse 27, and then from Genesis 2 and verse 18 and following, talking about the explanation that the Bible gives as for marriage. So in Genesis 2:18 and following, you have that account where Adam is by himself in the garden and he's naming the animals. And the observation there is made that it is not good that Adam is alone. And so, as part of God's created order, he establishes a change where he introduces Eve. He creates her out of Adam's side, brings her to him. Adam rejoices, and then you have that commentary in the book of Genesis where it says, "For that reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife," in Genesis 2, verse 24. And so that establishes a very important fact as we consider together what Christ teaches about divorce. The first thing we have to know is that marriage is established by God. Marriage is established by God. It's not a human convention. It's one of God's creation ordinances. So whenever we ask questions about divorce, we have to answer them in light of God's ownership of this institution of marriage. We have to answer them in light of God making male and female and bringing them together and making them one flesh in marriage. So where did marriage come from? Well, marriage comes from God. God is the one who instituted it at creation. Before the fall, marriage was there. The second question that we have to understand before we start talking about divorce, we have to ask ourselves, what does marriage do? So marriage is established by God. Now, what does marriage do? And again, we go back to Genesis 2 and verse 18, where we see, again, God establishing this marriage as this new unit where a man leaves his father and his mother and holds fast to his wife. And at the end of verse 24, it says something very telling that sometimes I'm afraid that we skip over. And it says there that they shall become one flesh. God does something in marriage. He takes two people and they don't become two people in one family. No, they become one flesh. These two people are united in a way that would resemble one human body. And so that's a significant thing that God does in marriage. Marriage becomes something more than a simple question about how two individuals should solve their problems. God has brought these two individuals together and has made them one flesh. So there are implications for considering divorce in that light as well. We're dealing with a relationship that is more than just a human convention. It is something that is established by God. It is one of His creation ordinances. So we answer all our questions in light of His ownership, in light of what He thinks about it, and also in light of this reality that these two human beings have become one flesh. We don't ask how people feel about it. We don't ask what our society thinks about it. We look at what God has said about it. And the default, the norm in terms of Scripture from Christ Himself with regards to marriage is found in verse 9 from our text, where it says, Jesus' summary of His answer, what therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So that's all before divorce. Now we can get to this question about divorce, because the Pharisees are not asking Jesus about marriage. The Pharisees are asking Jesus about divorce. They're saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And again, this is a very pertinent question for our society, which is rife with divorce, and it is a very personal question for some of us here today. So the Pharisees asked this question. What is Jesus' answer? In verse 3. Well, here Jesus answers them by directing them to Moses. In other words, Christ is directing them to the commandments of God. And this is very familiar territory for the Pharisees. The Pharisees knew the commandments of God. And so in their mind, they are going to Deuteronomy 24. And I want to read Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. And it would probably be helpful for you to take that out and follow along, because it's a fairly lengthy quotation. And we're going to make some observations about this text. But here in the Old Testament, you have the default reference for people who are looking to justify divorce. And in Deuteronomy 24, starting in verse 1, it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So the Pharisees ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Jesus says, what did Moses command you? And the Pharisees, thinking of this text, say, Moses says yes. Moses says yes. But this text and the Old Testament teaching on divorce as a whole requires some closer examination. Are the Pharisees right in saying that Moses permits divorce? Well, in some sense, we shouldn't be guided by the conclusion that we would want to reach. We shouldn't say, well, I want the Bible to say that divorce is not allowed, so therefore in the Old Testament there is no way that divorce is ever even considered. In some sense, the Pharisees are correct. In the Old Testament, divorce is assumed. There is a sense in which in the Old Testament, the language assumes that divorce is happening. But that is not the same thing as approving of it. So, ask yourself, this law that we just read from Deuteronomy 24, what is it really about? Is it really a law that permits and approves of divorce? It's not actually a law about divorce. It's a law about what happens to relationships after divorce. So the law in Deuteronomy 24 is saying, if there is a divorce, so in that sense, the Old Testament is assuming divorce. So it's assuming it. But after this divorce, if you send your wife away and she marries another, once that marriage also is annulled, you cannot remarry that person. That would be an abomination. So it's talking about relationships after divorce. And the law, therefore, is regulating something that it assumes while not approving of it. In fact, when you look at the Old Testament, there is not a positive command about divorce. The best you can say is that there are times where divorce is assumed, and at worst you can say, in a lot of the Old Testament, when it's dealing with divorce, it's actually dealing with forbidding divorce in certain situations. Divorce is never commanded, and there are times where divorce is forbidden. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 22 and verse 19 and following, where it talks about a man who publicly accuses his wife falsely. So there's a public accusation from a husband that his wife has been unfaithful to him prior to marriage, that she is guilty of fornication. And it says that there's a process that they're to walk through, And if that process proves that the woman is innocent and that the man has accused her falsely, the command from Scripture is that that man may never divorce that woman. That's the command of Scripture in chapter 22 of Deuteronomy. Now, there's a different outcome if the accusation is true. If the accusation is true and the woman was unfaithful before they got married, there is a divorce, but it's not how you think. The divorce comes through stoning, because if the woman is unfaithful, she is stoned to death, and therefore the marriage is over. It says in the same sense in Deuteronomy 22, verse 29, that if a man lies with an unmarried virgin, that he is obligated to marry her without the option of divorce. So in some places in Scripture, in the Old Testament, divorce is acknowledged and admitted and regulated, but never do you find a place in Scripture where divorce is approved. That's what Jesus means when in our text he talks about in verse 5 the hardness of heart, that Moses wrote this commandment because of the hardness of heart of the people of Israel. He is acknowledging divorce. Moses is. He is, in some sense, administering regulations around it while not giving approval for it. The laws of divorce in the Old Testament were an acknowledgement of the reality, but not an approval of the practice. And these laws, therefore, are grounded in the reality of life after the fall, a life of sin, a life where people do sinful things, and divorce is one of those things. And what should life be like in light of this sinful world that we live in? And Jesus, in responding to the question, understanding the reality of the human condition, in verse 6, moves beyond Moses. So he asked the Pharisees about Moses, and then he moves 2,000 years prior to Moses. He asks what Moses says, and then in his answer, he goes beyond to creation. He appeals to God making male and female, and that these male and female have become one flesh. So, yes, Moses assumes divorce and governs certain aspects of it, but Jesus is appealing to creation. He's appealing to a time prior to Moses. And so, when the Pharisees ask Christ, can a person get divorced? What is not part of Jesus' answer is an appeal to difficult situations in marriage, or personal feelings about a love that is lost, or a record of transgressions that have piled up and been tabulated over time, or even talking about a failure to be amended in a certain sin. The thing that Christ wants to consider is God, His work, and why He made them and what happens in it. God taking male and female, making them one flesh in marriage. And so the Pharisees ask, can a man divorce his wife? And in Jesus, in verse 9, says, no. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So in other words, Jesus answers this question not by looking at what is expedient or what is convenient, but directing man to look at marriage in terms of God as the one who institutes marriage, where He changes two people, one man and one woman, and makes them into one flesh. And Jesus says, generally speaking, what God has joined together, man should not separate. And it says in verse 10 through 12, this additional level of teaching, that the disciples wait until they get Jesus by Himself. And then they ask Him some follow-up questions. And Jesus' explanation about divorce becomes even more forceful when He makes it to His disciples. If a person divorces and marries another, it says in verse 11, that he commits adultery. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, that she commits adultery. That is the means of the marriage covenant. When you enter into this marriage covenant that is established by God, your covenant before the Lord is not voided by divorce. To enter into marriage is to adopt an institution that belongs to God, that cannot be left by human will. That is Jesus' general rule about divorce. In other words, he's saying marriage is God's, not yours. Marriage is yours to steward. Marriage is yours to live in and under for the glory of God. Now, because of the difficulty of this subject, it is incumbent on us to think a little bit about if there's any wiggle room. Is this simply an absolute statement by Christ that marriage in all circumstances must be preserved, and that divorce in all circumstances is tearing apart what God has joined together? And typically, when you look at Scripture, you can look about general rules of divorce, which says preservation, but then also recognize that there are several exceptions. The general rule is what God has joined together, man should not separate. But there are two exceptions that the Bible gives where divorce is lawful. And that is in the area of sexual immorality and the area of desertion. So Jesus in other places teaches on divorce as well. For example, Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. And there he expounds and expands on what he has said in this text. And he says there, everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality, and continues on in the same way. In Matthew 19 verse 9 as well, very well-known section where Jesus teaches on divorce. He says, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality. The same thing. Very plainly stated in Scripture that divorce is lawful in the case of sexual immorality. And that truth is built on what is taught in the law of God, in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books, the books of Moses. So, for example, you can go to Deuteronomy 22 and verse 21, where God establishes the right response to adultery. It says there, if a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. The man who lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. So what's going on there? Well, adultery, if Israel is living according to the commandments of Moses, adultery automatically would end the marriage, because the guilty offender would be stoned to death. There would be no more husband. There would be no more wife. So in God's sight, adultery, which is punishable by death, ends the covenant relationship. And the offended party then is free. And in some sense, that's the simpler one, where there's direct statements of Scripture where Christ says, if you divorce for any reason except for sexual immorality. But then there's this other exception that you find in Scripture, primarily in 1 Corinthians 7, which deals with what's called desertion. And it's a more complicated exception. It's reserved in reality, in 1 Corinthians 7, it's reserved for the marriage between the believer and the unbeliever. So 1 Corinthians 7 verse 15 says, if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. So if there is a person who is a believer who is married to an unbeliever, maybe they were converted after they were married, or maybe they entered into this marriage relationship sinfully and foolishly, maybe they were unequally yoked, whatever the case may be, if your unbelieving partner separates from you, then you are to let them go, and God sets you free. You are no longer enslaved. But that doesn't really speak to the Christian, does it? Because what if there is separation in a Christian couple? What if a believing partner separates? Is it still the same thing? If a believing partner separates, let it be so. That would be the equivalent of 1 Corinthians 7:15. Well, that's not the case. A few verses earlier, in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10 and 11, it says, the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. and the husband should not divorce his wife. So the default for the Christian that's living in a situation where there is estrangement, where there is separation, the default for the Christian is what? It's reconciliation. It's to be brought back together. And then it starts getting complicated, because what happens if a believing spouse is unwilling to be reconciled? What do you do with a spouse who claims to be a believer, who is unwilling to submit themselves to God's Word? Can the person then at that moment say, well, my husband, my wife has deserted me, and so therefore I am free to divorce? No. Because the separation which is allowed in terms of divorce is only between the believer and the unbeliever. It's not between two believers. So what happens? What if there's no willingness to be reconciled? Well, then we enter into exhortation. We enter into the territory of Matthew 18, verse 15 and following, where believers are to confront other believers over their unwillingness to repent. And so maybe it's the wife who has to confront the husband over his unwillingness to reconcile, or maybe it's the husband who confronts the wife over her unwillingness to reconcile. And if that spouse will not listen, you go with another and you confirm their sin to them, and you reinforce the biblical mandate to be reconciled. And if that person still doesn't listen, then you tell it to the church. And if that person will not listen to the church, then you cut them off from the church and you count them as an unbeliever, which brings you back to 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 15. But you see, it's not simply claiming desertion for the Christian. For the Christian, the goal is always reconciliation. It's not as simple as just saying, well, he has deserted me, and so now I will pursue divorce. For the Christian to pursue divorce over desertion, the spouse must be involved in this effort that takes time, in which reconciliation is sought. Reconciliation is pursued not just as an individual, but with the help of brothers and sisters, and even with the help of the church elders. The spouse, in order to be divorced over desertion, must be married to an unbeliever, and that unbeliever must be unwilling to fulfill the marriage vows and demonstrate that by their separation. Now, that also is complicated. Because what is separation? What is desertion? Can it be emotional over a long period of time? Emotional withdrawal? Can it be physical withdrawal? Could it be somebody who is physical and verbal, physically and emotionally and verbally abusive? Well, certainly physical abuse is always outside the question, but isn't it right that we're all at times verbally abusive to each other? When we speak to each other in anger? When we say things to hurt the other person? All of us do that. And is that not some form of verbal abuse? Emotionally, when we withhold affection, when we fail to come alongside the spouse when they need us the most, isn't that some form of emotional abuse? Maybe you think that's too strong a word, but certainly it's an emotional deficit that you've created in the marriage. These are real things that we all endure. Now, what's the line? Where does it become desertion? Well, it certainly isn't something that we can just decide on our own. We have a Monday, things aren't going well, and we decide that's it, desertion is the way to go, and we autonomously decide that divorce is now lawful. There cannot be divorce within Christian marriage over desertion. That must be established between a believer and an unbeliever. So the Christian must start with seeking reconciliation. We do that in the little annoyances that we have in our marriages. We even can do that in the major sins that we have in our marriages. Why? Because God has joined you together, male and female, and He's made you one flesh. And if there is an unwillingness to repent, you pursue discipline through the church in the hopes not of being able to divorce, in the hopes of effecting repentance. Now, of course, that should not be done foolishly. That should not be done foolishly. If there is physical abuse or other danger in the home, there should be an immediate separation for the safety of the one being exposed to danger. But the goal and the hope also in that situation should still be the repentance of the sinner and the restoration of the marriage. Why? Because God has joined you together and has taken male and female and made you one flesh. So that is very counter to what our society would say about divorce. Very counter. And so, first lesson is that we should be careful not to let society shape our understanding of divorce. If this teaching on divorce grates on you, look in the Scriptures. See if the Scripture is as I have described it. See, society has ingrained in us all sorts of unlawful approaches to divorce. So take the so-called no-fault divorce. Divorce for any and every reason. You've gotten on each other's nerves long enough, and it's time just to end the misery. People sue for divorce because the spouse has a budget, or because the spouse not keeping to the budget, because the spouse has said cruel things to them, or the spouse has even raised their voice at them. Maybe it's even something like the spouse has gotten drunk, even repeatedly, or the spouse is a blasphemer. Well, in these cases, divorce is not the way of the Christian. The question is not what the world says about it, what my friends have counseled me to do, what this blog or that book has said. The question is, what has God said? And Christ sets before us that generally speaking, there are, of course, outlying exceptions, but generally speaking, man should not separate what God has joined together. There are these exceptions of sexual immorality and desertion, and there are circumstances where safety and health demand an immediate separation, but these make the rule even more clear, these exceptions. The aim is to preserve what God makes one when He brings male and female together. The second thing that we learn is that the call in marriage is to reconciliation, not separation. So what do you do with the sins that you will face in your marriage? You face sins in your marriage. I know we pretend when we come here that we don't have any problems in our marriage. We all have problems in our marriage. We have sin in our marriage. We say cruel things to each other. And we use our time selfishly. And there is financial mismanagement, I'm sure, in our homes. And in some cases, you might even be able to point to drunkenness, or even a pattern of drunkenness, or even more grievous sins like addiction or the use of pornography, even all the way up to adultery itself. Even in the cases, the worst cases, where divorce is permitted, or you could make a good case that there is legitimate desertion in the marriage, divorce is permitted perhaps, but it is never required. The call of the Christian is always first to reconciliation. Always first to the restoration of this union which God made, where God took two people and made them into one flesh. In the sins of our daily life, we have to exercise grace with each other, knowing our own sins. Why are we patient with each other? Or why should we be patient with each other? Well, because we know the patience of our spouse with us. Because we know the different ways that our spouse tolerates our sins. In the sins that even in the sins that warrant a demand for change, we should come to each other with humility, seeking the good of the other person, even in the involvement of other people, crying out to the other person for restoration. And in the sins that may permit divorce, we should carefully examine to see if there is no possible way that reconciliation could happen. Why? Because married people aren't managing something that belongs to them. Because married people aren't just managing their own relationship. Married people have entered into an institution established by God, and it is their obligation to steward it for His glory. So, Christian, what does life under Christ look like in marriage? How do sinful people live together in this institution that Christ has established, that God has established in creation? It is not to turn a blind eye to sin. It is not to live idealistically in marriage as if there are no problems that need to be addressed. But it is to live in marriage recognizing that you as husband and wife have been made one. That the norm is that you must live as one. That what God has joined together, you should not separate. And yes, you will deal with sin. And yes, maybe you will even be forced to deal with major sin. But you will deal with it as one flesh. Because the Christian mandate for most situations is quite straightforward. Now, I didn't say easy, quite straightforward. What God has joined together, far be it from you and me to tear it apart. Let's pray together.